We've embraced change a lot. We'll change up the lines a little bit. We'll change up our strategy a little bit. And that's not a scary thing. That's a good thing.
53 consecutive completions to run out the remaining time on the Atlanta Hustle season. Execution in crunch time and just guts and will. And we saw that from the Carolina Flyers.
You know it ain't over, right? We got some unfinished business.
It's a Callahan for Lucas McClamrock.
Who else but Jacob Fairfax?
And the Hustle convert the break in spectacular fashion.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass Week 2 Preview Pod coming at you. I'm Adam Ruffner, and I'm joined by Evan Lepler. Evan, we had a fantastic Week 1 intro to the 2025 UFA season. Action all over the league, upsets, and I think just a lot of curiosity and intrigue as to what teams are going to bring into the landscape this season. What are kind of your reflections, having had now a couple of days to think over the initial onslaught of games? I mean, you had a fantastic Tuesday toss this week up on the Watch UFA website, a lot of good interviews and quotes from coaches and players from around the league. But what is your takeaway from Week 1, and how does it construct into all of these, I think, really important early season games that we've got going into Week 2?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Good to be with you as always. Appreciate the kind words about the toss. There are a few kind of big picture thoughts that I have. One that's kind of, kept percolating in my mind, especially since the Atlanta Salt Lake game. Like, that game in particular was about as well as two teams could play in Week 1 of the season. Like, I don't remember a Week 1 game where just two teams looked more midseason form, both in terms of speed and decisiveness and preparation and like just the whole package. That was just an awesome game. And those just two teams were ready to go. Like, New York and Oakland both had some hiccups, and every other team kind of had some hiccups. Like, there weren't that many hiccups in that Salt Lake Atlanta game. Like, for the most part, there wasn't a lot of sloppy play. There was just a lot of complexity in the way that both teams kind of threw different looks at each other. So I think that was really interesting. I think that leads kind of into my thought on, well, Atlanta's got a leg up on Carolina this week just because Atlanta looked really, really ready to go, and Carolina does not have its A team. Now, the Flyers could still go down there and be very competitive and win, but I also think, like, remember when Atlanta went up to Carolina last year and I think lost by 7 or 8? Like, I feel like we could see the reverse of that this year, which isn't to say that, the Hustle are going to be the better team at the end of the year, because I think I have a healthy respect for Carolina and what they're building. And yeah, I mean, the other big picture thought is just, I mean, who in their right mind had Philly winning at DC? And as I said in the toss, like, if Philly can win at DC, and then anybody can win anywhere. Detroit could win at Breeze Stevens Field. Heck, they were within 1 in the fourth quarter last year at Breeze. So, like, we're in a whole new world of the UFA. Like, there's no way Vegas is winning at Salt Lake. I'm saying that right now. There's just absolutely no way. But, like, there's the kernel of hope for the Bighorns because of what we saw the Phoenix do last week. And there's got to be a belief that anything is possible. What you've had a few days to kind of reflect on things too. Like, what are your biggest picture thoughts leading into Week 2?
I'm always one to draw parallels to the NBA, and of course, we've got a really good first round slate of games and playoff action in that league. And one of the narratives and kind of coverage angles I've started to hear in the media that covers the Professional Basketball Association is this idea that success is no longer necessarily determined by the stars or the best player in a given roster, but it's your ability to bring up that floor. And I feel like we're starting to see that in the UFA as well, where we can talk all day about sort of pillar players and stars and all UFA selections on any given team. There's a lot of talent in this league, but oftentimes it comes down to what is kind of your 5, 6, 7 guys doing on any given rotation? Like, how are you implementing them and putting them in positions to succeed? And I think with teams like a Salt Lake and Atlanta, you have such good depth and coaching that you see this incredible level of play because there's no real weak links. There's no sort of bumps in the road. Everything just flows together. And I think you're going to see that more and more as we progress deeper into the 2025 schedule of which teams can sort of mask their inefficiencies or play most to their strengths and not, allow a team to exploit, the mismatch or develop a kind of leverage point in a given matchup. I think that you're going to see that again more and more as teams become, smoother, as there's less and less of these kind of early season self-inflicted mistakes, and we get more and more performances like what we saw in last week's game of the week.
I think it's a good point, and I also think I think you would agree teams are closer packed. Like the best teams are closer together than perhaps they ever had been before, and because of that, like circumstances each week, how you handle the wind, what the game plan is, both independent of the wind and particularly how you adapt your game plan on the fly for changing conditions. Those are really important things that are going to swing close games. I think that's going to be something too. The little tweaks that coaches make will swing results this year. Where 4, 5, 10 years ago, we're like, yeah, coaches can scheme whatever, but the talent is going to win the day. Now it feels like players obviously win games, but on the margins, those little tweaks and in-game adjustments and ability to be adaptable is more important than ever.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to, the reigning champion Minnesota Wind Chill. Their strength last year was their depth and versatility, and I think you're really starting to see that become a meta in the league as a whole. You just have more and more teams not only having, their universe lines, so to speak, but a couple of kind of rotations that they can employ in various conditions or weathers. I think that's how the Wind Chill weathered the storm of all the wind at, the championship weekend event out in Salt Lake last August, where they could throw a couple of different throwing lineups. They could have a few different sort of defensive looks. I think you're seeing the same thing from like a team like Atlanta, where they're not just going to have, the same 7 starting offense every single point of a given game. They go 10 deep on that side of the disc, and they can throw a couple of different looks at you. And I think you're just going to see teams that have that ability be able to prevail more and more in this league.
Yeah, that and just the culture and kind of consistency that a team like Atlanta has built. They can add in 4 new faces on the O-line from Adam Miller, Sean Cannell, Cameron Brock, and Alec Wilson-Holiday, and it can still feel more or less like the same offense that we've watched the hustle the past few years with Austin Taylor, Brett Holzmeyer, Hayden Austin Nab, and then, Eckwurzel and Olsen get some points here and there too. But isn't that fascinating that half of their O-line changed? Now it helps that they all are experienced players, and yet just they carved up a Salt Lake defense that was not too shabby by any means. So yeah, that was just such an awesome game.
I know I keep playing this chord throughout the week, but Salt Lake did the same thing against Atlanta. They lost half of their starting offensive rotation from last year and just absolutely blitzed the hustle coverage continually throughout the night. They had a 72% offensive conversion rate against an Atlanta defensive squad that I think is universally accepted as being like a top 5 unit in this league, and again, it's just
Salt Lake's offense was much better in week 1 than it was the second half of the season last year.
Oh man.
Now part of that was Chad Jorgensen and Will Selfridge playing together. We haven't seen that a lot, but
that's
those two,
a lot of speed. That's a lot of velocity coming at you.
I just, do you think the Shred continue that throughout? They have a lot of big games coming up, not necessarily this weekend, but, games against the Spiders and Cascades, and obviously they play the Summit twice in July. I feel like those are probably their 2 best players right now, Chad Jorgensen and Will Selfridge. And, Chad, I've just been I've been seduced by watching Chad Jorgensen be so good leading that D line in so many different ways, with the way he gets blocks, with the way he creates breaks. And, like I was going to say, if only they had two Jorgensens. Well, obviously they do. They have three when Luke comes back from his injury. But yeah, I'd be curious to see how they manage that, because I think they realize that those are kind of their two biggest weapons. And how aggressive and they're still both young, obviously. Like, how aggressive can the shred be? I'm not even thinking about this coming weekend against Vegas, but down the road of, letting those guys go both ways. Because I kind of, we saw Selfridge a little bit crossover down the stretch.
Hold on. I've got a nugget for you. I was talking with somebody from Minnesota who watched the Shred do what they did offensively this past Saturday in the ATL, and he straight up said, man, I hope that, this Shred offense settles a little bit, because this team speed and the way that they're attacking space is terrifying. And that's from, again, like a windshield defensive unit that takes a ton of confidence going into virtually every single scenario. They were just kind of, opening their eyes to this Chad Jorgensen, Selfridge, McKay Jorgensen, Braden Eberhart, excuse me, blitzing attack. Like, there's just so much to handle, and they come at you so quickly. I mean, how many of those Salt Lake offensive drives were conducted in 45 seconds or under? Like, they were just absolutely running it up.
And Jordan Kerr looked good, and he looked good as like the fourth or fifth option. He's been an MVP candidate in this league 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And, you don't forget about him when he's out there. He was really good, but he's, in a way, it feels like he's passed the torch a little bit in terms of being like the go-to guy. And it really fits nicely.
Yeah, and I think it kind of gets back to when he was an MVP finalist 2 years ago, where he was kind of more of a finisher. A lot of his stats came, within 30 or 20 yards of the goal line, where he could just sort of pick apart a defense, use that lefty vision, and just find the gaps with either his throws or his legs. And I think you're kind of seeing him return to that. He's back in full health this season after having that damaged wing in the tail half of last year that sort of coincided with the Shred's downfall after their 6-0 start. But, I think we should probably put a lid on sort of our generalized thoughts and get into this week 2 schedule that is just thick with competition. I think, coming into the season, we might have looked at this slate of games and thought, a little light. But as you and I were talking in the pre-show, that is not the case in reality right now. One day out from Friday night's Madison at Houston matchup and the Friday night Frisbee showcase on YouTube. But then on Saturday, you've got the game of the week with Carolina making their 2025 debut after being in the championship game last season, heading down to face their fiercest rivals in Atlanta in the game of the week again. That'll be on Watch UFA TV. You've got Oakland at Seattle, which might be the most intriguing matchup of the weekend, if not for the fact that you have this rebooted team, the Toronto Rush, coming down from Canada and playing a reeling DC squad, and then a rejuvenated Philly team, the East Division kind of heading in all sorts of different directions. Where do you want to start kind of talking about, again, this sort of full plate of really important early season games?
I mean, we could start anywhere. Let's start with Oakland, Seattle. It's interesting. Like, there's part of me that wishes this was a night game out in Seattle, and then it wouldn't be interfering with the East Coast Saturday night window, because basically we got Hustle Flyers, Rush Breeze, and Spinners or Spiders Cascades all at the same time in that like 7:00 Eastern time slot. And then you have Madison, Austin coming at 8:00 Eastern on Saturday night. But it's a really good window to get multiple devices rolling and watch UFA.tv. I think, the big question coming into this game, I mean, there are two big questions. Like, can the Spiders on the road carry the momentum that they created last Thursday night against the Empire? Because they were undoubtedly impressive. After a slow start, they really won that game going away. And the thought after the weekend was like, all right, like Oakland has proven themselves. Well, if they go and lay an egg and start slowly up in Seattle, that narrative is going to change really, really quick. And, while the Spiders are certainly a stronger squad than they were last year, the Cascades were the better team in that matchup last year, certainly in the playoff game. And Seattle's got a bunch of interesting pieces on their season opening squad as well. I'm excited to see Connor Belfield make his UFA debut for the Cascades, a really speedy downfield guy who can make waves on O or D. Obviously, they have the championship weekend experience. And, for Seattle, like, this is a game that they expect to win at home. They lost once in the regular season against Oakland at home, but they got the win in the playoffs. And yeah, I mean, if the Cascades are going to be a team that we think of as, very capable of defending their crown against, Salt Lake, who looked really good last week, Colorado, who looked really good last week, and Oakland, who looked really good last week. Like, this is a prove-it game for Seattle in a lot of ways, even though, like, by no fault of their own, I feel like their perceptions have dipped after the first week of the season just because the other teams in their division out west are looking so strong.
Yeah, I agree. Seattle, in my power rankings too, kind of suffered from just the impressiveness of the rest of the West. And I think that they've got a pretty tall task in defending their divisional throne right now. Like, we came into this season maybe underestimating the West as a division as a whole, and it's just going to be an absolute dogfight once again out on that left coast. And I think for Seattle, what it comes down to for me in 2025 is, can they reasonably replicate last season's defensive successes? Because by basically any metric, the Scades were a top 5 defensive team in 2024. That was a big reason why they made it all the way to the league semifinals. And in particular, they were great at denying goal line opportunities to opposing offenses. They led the league last year in opponent red zone percentage. They held opponents to just 73.7% in the red zone last year. And coming out of week one, we kind of got dazzled by the Leo Gordon show in his professional debut and all the different release angles he has, particularly in tight quarters situations. But it's going to be a real kind of matchup to watch between this Spiders offense that did well in the red zone, but still converted under 80% on the game against New York, versus a Seattle squad that I think kind of tees off in that area of the field. They have the reigning defensive player of the year in Lucas Ambrose, back-to-back leader of the league in blocks. And we might get a Gordon versus Ambrose matchup. We might see him kind of playing a little bit more in lane spaces, trying to anticipate some of that receiver-to-receiver motion that the Spiders like so much in their 2025 look so far. I just think it's going to be a really dynamic game to watch. I think this could easily be, a 20-plus goal scoring game for both squads. And especially in the second half, might just kind of be trading knockout blows. And yeah, I think, heading into it, Seattle has a little bit of an edge, but after week one, outside of Philly, there wasn't a more impressive team, I thought, as far as exceeding expectations than the Oakland Spiders squad. Like, they look to be the real deal.
One matchup in this game that I'm excited about, and I don't know for sure that this will be a matchup, but Zeppelin Raunig, 43 goals last year for the Cascades, still young, still hungry, really talented player coming into his own. And I thought Oakland, I almost called him San Jose. I thought Oakland's Max Williams was really good downfield last week.
Absolutely.
Whether it was on Yacht or Chartok or whoever. And like, I could just envision Max Williams chasing Zeppelin Raunig around. And that's a really fun matchup that could go a long way in terms of, dictating whether the Cascades can get holds, whether Raunig can be thwarted by a guy like Williams, who really, suffocated the New York Cutters he matched up with last week. And, Robin Vickers-Batsdorf coming off an honor roll performance against Jack Williams. Does he match up with a guy like Aaron Wolf? Spencer Lofink is currently listed as out Maybe Vickers Batsdorf chases around Christian Foster in a very spicy matchup for the Spiders D line versus the Cascades O line. A couple of fiery guys there squaring off, perhaps. So yeah, this is just a really really good game, and I think for those around the league who don't necessarily believe that like Oakland and Seattle are up to snuff with like New York, DC, Carolina, Atlanta, Chicago, Minnesota. Like the the other thing I said to Oakland after the game last week, because I rewatched the Oakland Seattle playoff game last week on game day before that New York Oakland game, and like the Spiders' offense was not good against the Cascades when they last went up to Seattle. They just looked totally different in the season opener. So that is something that like the Cascades need to be ready for the Spiders being able to hold more relentlessly. And yeah, I mean, do we want to make picks? Because I think I'm leaning Oakland's way after what I saw in person last week, and I'm ready to be wrong. But we saw Oakland win up in Seattle last year, and I think I'm leaning the Spiders again.
I can't fault you there. I'll still take the home team. I think the Scades have a little bit of magic playing at Memorial Stadium. That D-line always gets real feisty in transition. I think that the Spiders are cruising a little bit out over their skis right now, with the amount of adulation that we've all been pouring on them after their win against New York. So I just think there might be a little bit of a recalibration here. Again, Cascades have been fed a bunch of good bulletin board material for a team that is defending its divisional throne. And I just think that there's enough good pieces. I think the point that you mentioned about Oakland's handler defensive starters, Robin Vickers Batsdorf, kind of leading that charge versus the Seattle backfield will be a matchup to watch. No Spencer Lofink. I thought he was one of the most impressive handlers in the West Division last year. He was so important as the kind of that pivot centerpiece in their backfield. Without him, it'll be interesting to see if Wolf takes over that position, if we see a lot of Tommy Lee and Christian Foster kind of balancing out the throwers for Seattle. I just think that there's a lot of interesting things to keep your eyes on. Kelly Johnson, the head coach of Seattle, also in her first official game as a head signal caller, but she's been instrumental for a really long time in the Scade success. Does she have a couple of curveballs up her sleeve in this matchup for Oakland that, showed a lot of their hand in week one? Does Seattle maybe have a couple of defensive coverage schemes to sort of stunt, Oakland's speed? We'll see. But yeah, I'll take Seattle as far as a pick, but honestly, it's a toss-up in my head. I think that this is going to be one of the most interesting hypothetical matchups that we have heading into week two. But we should shift on. Let's move on to the game of the week. Again, a rematch of last year's South Division thriller with Carolina persevering at the very end against Atlanta, once again handing the Hustle heartbreak at home in the postseason, one game shy of Atlanta's first trip to championship weekend. That has happened each of the last two seasons, but the Hustle getting a huge home win to start off this year. They really look like a championship favorite at the beginning of this season, but the Flyers, they've always kind of been the historical big brother in this regional rivalry. And with the kind of absences that they have going into this week two matchup, it feels, I know you started off this episode saying that we could see a pretty dominant Hustle victory. I don't disagree with you. It also feels like it could be one of those Carolina games where they sneak away with a 1 or 2 goal win and we all come away going, it's Carolina again, dang it. They're doing it again. They're a competitor again. Like they're a contender again. Like I feel like we are so accustomed to seeing the star names on this team, seeing them maybe lose a couple, and everyone just starts pulling fire alarms and worrying about what's going to happen with the Flyers. And then at the end of every season, they're one of the 4 to 6 best teams in the entire association. Is that going to happen again in 2025? What do you see heading into this game of the week matchup on Saturday night?
Yeah, that's definitely going to happen. Like they could lose this game by 12 goals, and I still would have them, as a true championship contender. There is a former Flyer getting married this weekend, which I think I don't know, but I think is an explanation for many of the absences, including a guy like Jacob Fairfax, who literally since 2019 has played in all but two Carolina Flyers games, but he's listed as out this weekend. So obviously that's a big loss. They're also missing veterans like Seth Weaver and Ethan Bloodworth and Elijah Long. So, this is a Flyers team that doesn't have many of the mainstays, and yet, Rutledge Smith making his first appearance. He played one Flyers game a couple of years ago, but really talented guy out of UNC. John McDonnell as well. I think you made a note in the power rankings that they're playing together this week for the first time in the UFA. Like a sneaky off-season addition. The irony, Jake Thorne was one of the reasons that Caleb Merriam became the coach of the Spiders. Like, Jake had no plans to join the Flyers. He was a Spider, scored 35 goals in 10 games last year for Oakland, was one of the guys that helped convince Caleb Merriam, because they go back to their Cal Poly slow days together. And then Jake's other job has a transfer, and all of a sudden he's in the triangle playing with Carolina. So that's a sneaky addition for a Carolina team. And, this is a Flyers roster, even if they're names that you're not as familiar with. They got a lot of really good players. They got a lot of really fast, athletic defenders. So I don't think Atlanta's going to have an easy game necessarily, but, the Hustle have pretty much their whole squad that played last week back in action. Frankie Fernandez and Michael Fairley both making their season debuts for their D-line. And Tuba is really high on both those guys, thinking they can both be shut down dudes defensively. So it's just hard for me to see Atlanta struggling offensively that often after they withstood the Salt Lake pressure. But as I wrote about in the toss, as Brett Holzmeyer pointed out, Carolina creates pressure points in different ways. So it is a different matchups, and we always say styles make fights. So I think this will be a fun, compelling, passionate, competitive game, as it always is when these two teams get together. But I would be surprised if Carolina went down to Atlanta and won this game. I think these teams are going to trade punches all season, Adam. They play each other 4 times in the regular season. I fully expect them to play in the South Division Championship game again for the second year in a row. And yeah, I would not be. I think the most likely scenario is that Atlanta holds serve at home. Maybe Carolina holds serve at home. Maybe it's 3-1 Atlanta in the regular season series. But either way, I think these are the two teams to beat in the South Division. And for me, one of the big storylines is can the Hustle do what they did last week again? And I think the answer is yes, because to be as polished as they were in week 1 last week, it really looked like they were kind of carrying over the end of their regular season. This is not the Flyers squad that went to Atlanta for the South Division title game a year ago.
Yeah, and just looking at the defensive absences for Carolina, I worry that Weaver, Tucker, no Bloodworth, no Wellers, no Christian Bielis, their 2 rookie standout sensations last year on the D-line. Those are absences that are really going to impact them against, again, the balance and spacing of this Atlanta offense. You kind of need a couple of horses in the stable just to throw at Holzmeyer as kind of sacrificial lambs, in the deep space, not get somebody just completely demoralized in 1-versus-1 matchups for 4 straight quarters against the best big in the league right now. But I don't see how Carolina impedes what the Hustle have going, especially how they looked in week 1, where is there going to be purchase without kind of a disruptor like Seth Weaver in the backfield for the Flyers defense? I think that's what they did so well in their playoff win last year in the South Division finale, where they got a lot of flustered reset looks out of the Hustle. They I think challenged a lot of short underneath throws, and anything that was swilly seemed like it was a Carolina disc to contest. And given, again, the sort of lineup absences that they're going to be experiencing, I just don't know that they're going to get the same breaks against this full steam ahead Atlanta attack.
Yeah, and the easy segue from that thought, Adam, is, well, the DC Breeze are 0-1. If we think Carolina's going to fall on Atlanta, the Flyers will be 0-1. The Breeze certainly had a week to make adjustments, recalibrate, reset emotionally with a hungry Toronto team coming in. And, it's got to be a fascinating kind of game planning process. Jamie Millage, the first year head coach of the Rush, he has been an assistant in the past, so he's not a total stranger to the UFA game. But there had to be some thought, going into this road trip for Toronto in the preseason. It's like, well, maybe we'll sit a guy out in DC, save him for Sunday, keep him fresh. I don't know how the Rush approach this. And for DC, this is huge, because if they're 0-2 going to face 0-1 Carolina next week on the road, their chances to host a playoff game, could be over by the end of week 3 in the league.
Slow down. I want to go back over the phrasing you just said. 0-2 DC versus 0-1 Carolina. What we all had penciled in on our schedules coming into this season. Oh.
I mean, I thought Carolina would be 0-1 at home going to face DC. Still think that. Certainly did not expect the Breeze to lose that first game against Philly. Thought that was, I wrote that win down in pen, and then all right, well, maybe they'll be 1-1. We'll see how good Toronto is. How good do you expect Toronto to be? Arvids Karklin's making his UFA debut along with Tom Blasman, Simone Gasparini, and Tom's Abeltines. Last I checked, they did not have Mark Lloyd active.
They do not. He is not active yet this season.
Yeah. But they do have Connor McHale.
Yeah. I'm a little worried about Toronto defensively as a whole. They have been one of the bottom feeders on that side of the disc for the past couple of seasons, with Phil Turner in and out of the lineup due to health issues. It's just been hard to really, I think, establish any sort of single coverage matchups for Toronto, and they don't have much in the way of a developed system either. And so it's just kind of resulted in a lot of shootouts and high scoring affairs. And so I think the Toronto offense is pretty accustomed to playing loose and open. It's that defensive side of the disc where you see DC, they're going to be having their 2025 debuts of Christian Boxley and Tyler Monroe. They're two, I think, best offensive finishers in their system right now.
I mean, they really missed time on last week. You could see that.
Oh, man. And he always has games against Philly, too. Him and Cole Jurek just absolutely love to light it up against the Phoenix. And so I think that Tymon's going to have a big game. I think that Boxley is going to be his sort of, just smooth self. I expect him to score anywhere between 4 and 7 scores on the game, assists and goals combined. And I think he'll just be, in his season debut, looking to be more of a facilitator, maybe than a receiving finisher. And I think against a Toronto team that is, again, going to be implementing so many new players together, it's going to look a lot like a DC squad that, we were, I think, hoping for last weekend, which is a little bit more free-flowing. There are some pretty notable absences for the Breeze. No Jeff Wodach, no Andrew Roy on the offensive side of the disc. Roy was really instrumental in establishing their possessions last week and has been, the number one quarterback in the backfield for this Breeze team since he arrived 2+ years ago. But he will be out, so I expect, DC to pick up their tempo a little bit in this game. And they've sort of always held edge against the Rush. The question I have is, can Toronto just come out and be bombastic enough in their sort of individual highlight playmaking and just sort of rejuvenated energy that has been building heading into this season to overwhelm DC, kick the Breeze down to 0-2, and really light this candle as far as a chaotic East Division goes? Is that what we're in store for?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question, and in terms of like how they're going to approach the game. By the way, Simone Gasparini, the Italian, now listed is out, so perhaps he will not be on the field for Toronto. But all the other international additions that I mentioned are active. So is Marty Gallant making his rush debut. You know, the Lewis brothers, Phil Turner, Oscar Stonehouse, Mike McKenzie, Ty Barbieri. Like this is a good Toronto squad that's hitting the road, and I think like Adam, the way you have to approach this is like just go for the win on Saturday and then go for the win on Sunday with whatever you have left, right? Like, isn't that the smartest way rather than trying to get a little fancy? Like,
Oh yeah.
obviously, yeah, watching the Rockets Warriors yesterday, they're talking at halftime like, does Golden State even try in the second half, or do they just pack it up and get ready for Game 6? Like, or that might have been a couple days ago. I don't know. That was last night. Um, all the NBA games are running together now. But yeah, like it's not Saturday night and Sunday night either. It's Saturday night and Sunday afternoon. And I've had players talk to me before about, you have 24 hours or even 21, 22 hours in between games. That's a huge difference from like the 18 hours that Toronto's going to have with the schedule that it is this weekend.
Yeah, and so I think to your point, you can't get cute about it. I think the Rush really have to come down the mountain running at this East Division. It's theirs for the taking. It's kind of anyone's this year. And, I think they really need to find their rhythm early and just kind of mash the controller at that point. Don't make it overly complicated. I think that, they're going to want to develop as many rotations and looks as they can. But if they find something that's working, exploit it. Like if you can come out of this weekend 2-0 leading the East Division, it'll be, the days of old in this league and in this East slate. Like this Rush team and this franchise used to just own serve against every single opponent week in, week out for over half a decade. And it's kind of been so long in the rearview mirror at this point that we've forgotten that they have that capability. But, they are bringing back some holdovers from those years. And I think that there's a real spark in the air that they could take advantage of.
They'd be thrilled to come out of this weekend 1-1. They
Oh,
would
yeah.
be overjoyed to be 1-1. The thing is, I don't know which game. Like they're underdogs at DC on Saturday. Who's the favorite on Sunday in Philly in your mind, knowing what we know now?
I think given their performance last weekend, it's got to be Philly. I think the Rush are going to be recombobulating on the road, as you pointed out a minute ago. There's going to be a certain tax and exhaustion, particularly in their first two games of the season. Maybe if they get, this kind of back-to-back 2 games in under 24 hours road trip in June when they're a little bit more conditioned, it might be a little bit more of they stay in rhythm, they're able to stay warm, and they can just endure it. This is a big ask coming right out of the gate and having these two opponents in this kind of scheduling order. So I think that the Rush are going to be road dogs in both their matchups. And again, that just means I think it takes a little bit of pressure off of Toronto, and it just allows them to come out and say, hey, like you were saying a moment ago, game at a time, and let's go take the East again.
Yeah, they're a juicy road dog, though. You look at the players that they've got, we've seen international players play really well immediately. And, Ty Barbieri, Mike McKenzie are probably two of the five best players in Canada right now.
Beasts.
So, yeah, like, if you told me I could take Toronto plus 2.5 at Philly, I would pounce on that immediately. Because I also look, Philly is just the enigma of the UFA, and they have been
so
for
many
5
enigmas,
years.
man. We haven't even talked about San Diego yet. We've got this Austin team that just put up 30, Oakland.
Yeah, but Philly, man, we've just seen Philly. We've like gotten our hopes up about Philly in the past, and then seen them not be able to get a single break for 4 quarters. And I don't know, like they obviously handled the conditions better than the Breeze. Another question, which could be its own podcast, like how worried are you about the Breeze in a stiff breeze? The evidence is mounting, and it's not good right now for DC. Maybe Boxley and Monroe, and another week of seasoning cures that, but the question has to be at least contemplated. And for Philly, like, how will they handle success? You know, when was the last time they beat a team with a winning record? And obviously, the Breeze are 0-1, so technically that stat still stands. And it's been a generation since the Phoenix have beaten a team with a winning record in the East Division. We'll throw that caveat in there because I think that they got a Flyers team on the second day of a back-to-back a few years ago when Carolina probably had a winning record. So, yeah, I'm fascinated by both of these games. How does DC respond to the loss? How does Philly respond to the win? No idea what to expect from Toronto, but I'm really excited to see Toronto and just to get a glimpse. I mean, I haven't watched Arvids Karklins play Frisbee since the semifinals at Worlds in 2022. Like, obviously, I've talked him up a lot. I've talked to people about him, but I haven't seen him in an opportunity like this for a really long time. So, I remember him absolutely dazzling, and he was super young then. So he's much closer to his prime now, but who knows? So, yeah. Like Toronto, Philly, I'm as excited about that game as I am any game this weekend, including those that we talked about already, just because like the opportunity is there for both of those teams to really announce themselves. Like, could you imagine if Philly gets to 2-0 after this game? It would just
Yes, they
be.
just beat DC. Like,
I know.
everything's on the table. I think what my kind of final thoughts on the East Division slate this weekend is one question for each of these teams. For Toronto, can their defense make a difference in both of the games? Can they establish some kind of quarter to quarter coverage scheme that holds up and it doesn't just devolve into huck for huck as many of the rush games have been over the past couple seasons? For DC, can they get back to where they were with situational ultimate? I mean, we talk about their struggles in the wind. How about the fact that their red zone offense has just completely fallen apart after being a league leader, in 2023? I think that the Breeze need to kind of acquit themselves of some of the skepticisms that we're starting to have about how this system functions in various scenarios. And so can they do that against a Toronto team that is going to be very athletic and fast, but might be able to, find some holes for this DC Breeze small ball attack? And then for Philadelphia, to your point, can they have two straight good games? Like, when is the last time we've seen that from this Philly team? They kind of get, these quote unquote epical wins every season or two, but then it doesn't really evolve into much more beyond that. Can they construct some actual success and, be at the top of the East Division standings after week 2?
Yeah, to your point, Adam, 7 red zone turnovers last week for the Breeze. That's a quarter of their giveaways, and including one in the final seconds that could have tied the game. DC in their last 2 games in the UFA, I know you pointed this out, 33 and a half turnovers per game in their last 2 games, obviously played in very windy conditions. We don't know what the weather's going to be like on Saturday in the district. I'll take the under if 33 and a half was the over under in terms of Breeze turns. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting. Should we turn the page to your Madison Radicals?
My Madison Radicals.
Taking on the Texas two-step?
Yeah, we should definitely touch on the Radicals Texas road trip. I think, as far as early season intrigue, I've been circling this one on my calendar for quite some time. I think I've been dropping it in as mentions in podcasts here and there. But
What do you expect from the Rads?
I think that this is going to be their season-defining moment. I think very similarly to the Rush, they would be thrilled with a 1-1 weekend, no matter how they kind of split their 2 games at Houston on Friday and then at Austin on Saturday against the 1-0 Soul. I think that the Rads just need to play their game. And I know that that's a really redundant thing to say with this Madison franchise, but it comes down to, can they get those 7 to 9 break scores per game that really vault them into a feisty contender? Without that defensive pressure, without kind of the ability to instill fear in transition when they're generating turnovers and able to capitalize at such a high rate that their opponents just start to wilt under the pressure. When Madison doesn't have that, they don't have the kind of offense to just be able to go out and outscore opponents. And so I just want to see Madison be able to, run its kind of double teams, flummox an offense into showing its second or third or fourth looks, and really being able to run out of turnovers and score in open field situations on defense.
One thing about the Friday night game in Houston, a couple things actually. Dalton Smith expected to make his Houston debut. Spoke with Havoc coach Bex Forth yesterday, and she's really excited to add him to the lineup. Thinks they really could use another handler of his caliber. Obviously, he has had a lot of success in this league, playing with Dallas at championship weekend. Played with Chicago at championship weekend 3 years ago. Have not seen him in the UFA since that 2022 championship game against New York. The other thing to mention, there are storms in the forecast tomorrow night in Houston. I'm hoping we can get the game in without significant delay. It is almost always windy at that stadium, regardless of the forecast. But the storms could make it an ugly game. And I do not expect this to be like Atlanta, Salt Lake with 20 consecutive O-line holds to start the first half. This is going to be a grinder and a field position game. Which team can punch in those breaks, because there are going to be break chances aplenty. Independent of the wind, I'm curious, Madison's strength has always kind of been their D-line, especially in recent years. What are you hearing about the Madison offense, and what is a reasonable expectation for the Radicals offense? I don't know if they can be great in the wind in Houston, but independent of that, do you think they can improve from where they were last year and be, a top half in the league offense from an efficiency standpoint?
I think they're going to be forced to improve. Coming out of the offseason, the big storyline has been the retirement of those veteran pieces that were sort of the glue holding together an otherwise pretty grindy Madison Radicals offensive unit. This offense has finished middle of the pack the past several seasons. It's often been tethered to the team's underperforming successes and sort of missing the playoffs for those several years in a row. And while they got back to, I think, a level of mediocrity that allowed them into the postseason last year, there's still a lot of questions, right, heading into 2025. So I think with the loss of those veterans, it's going to force Madison into a much more new school approach, quicker disc movement, not necessarily relying on a QB1 that just anchors in the backfield, but more so getting the disc out quickly, allowing Kai Marcus to take deep looks when they're there, but really, I think, operating more from a spread attack and kind of putting the disc out in front of coverage, making sure that they're really attacking quickly. I was able to drop into a late season practice at Brees Stevens about 10 days ago. I think it was about that long ago at this point. It feels longer, with week 1 behind us at this point. But I was able to drop into practice for a second, and you could just see the intensity and the velocity of disc movement was just a lot quicker right now than where we're traditionally used to seeing this Madison offense play at. So I think that they're going to be quicker, kind of like what we've seen from these West Division teams, just a lot more of an ability to attack mid spaces, maybe because they don't have a depth at deep thrower. There's kind of Kai Marcus, and then beyond that, I think there's going to be sort of an open casting call for who else can really boost it on this Madison team. So with that, how can this Radicals offense, develop into its roles? Like, who is going to be the sort of 1A quarterback on this offense alongside Kai Marcus? Because we know he's going to chuck it deep.
Yeah. I think it's the other Kai. I think it's Kai DiLorenzo, who was injured a whole lot of last year.
Yeah, and has platooned a lot on defense, but he definitely has a developing throwing bag. He has a really good rhythm and feel for the offense. I know that's kind of an intangible thing to talk about. We talk about players and their skill sets, but when you watch him, he just has that knack for operating between being a thrower and being a receiver, knowing kind of when to activate in either role. I agree with you. I think DiLorenzo could be a big piece. They've brought in Kainua Chunmoy, who grew up in the Madison area, has played in Philadelphia, most recently in the UFA. He's coming into the system. He could be a player to watch, is kind of a dynamic talent. I think it's going to be a pretty, again, open cast of contributing characters from this Radicals team. I think that they've kind of decentralized away from any sort of given star. I mean, Anthony Gutowski was the goal scoring finishing sensation last year, but outside of that, you got to kind of list 8 or 9 guys in a cast to really get a sense of what makes this Madison team successful.
Yeah, Gutowski, 90 goals in 2 seasons in the UFA. The other X factor for Madison is the status of Max Sample. He tweaked something, I understand, during a scrimmage that the Radicals had with the champs in Minnesota last weekend, and he's listed as questionable. We'll see how he's feeling. We'll see what the Radicals do. I mean, you know this better than I and can speak to it better than I can, but they're a different team when he's on the field feeling good. He opens up a lot of different things, not just at the end of quarters, but in the flow of the attack.
He's one of the 3 tallest players in the league, and he's getting more and more mobile as he finds more comfort at the pro level. I mean, last year you could just see in numerous matchups, there's no real way to deal with him when he gets a good read on the disc and settles underneath of it. He's just immovable as far as a positioning standpoint. And he's getting, again, more and more fleet of foot. So he's kind of operating more as a distributor. Him and Gabe Vordick on the offense have a terrific kind of rhythm together as a cutting pairing. And yeah, without him in the lineup, there's just a little bit less of a vertical dimension to this Radicals attack. And without that, they, I think, might overheat in some of their quick disc movement. I think, Sample provides that sort of release valve and that ability to just keep defenses honest, knowing that the big guy can score at any given time.
Yeah, from the other perspective, like, this is a massive game for the Houston Havoc. To start 0-2 at home when you had a good preseason, you signed some pieces that are intriguing. Bexforth has been really working hard to develop players. Like, they add Kyle Kalafa, who had never played a competitive game of Frisbee before his first UFA game last year. And they've got athletes. They've got a lot of players that I'm intrigued about. Mark Turner was really good last week in his UFA debut. And I just kind of assume, I'm like, oh, he's probably a young college kid I haven't heard of, out of Rice or Texas Tech or something like that. No, Turner's in his 30s, grew up playing Ultimate in Hawaii, and just now lives in Texas, and like showed up to a 3-on-3 like just workout, and they're like, oh yeah, we like this guy, and he's dropping hammers on his first touch for beautiful dimes in the end zone. Like, Mark Turner,
those guys, hoopers, man. Like, he has that feel. I know he jumped out immediately on film. It's like, who is this guy with this complete edge control on his throws?
So, like, Houston is absolutely capable of winning this game against Madison. And for the Havoc season, as you said, like, this is their season. They're not going to come back and compete for a playoff spot after starting 0-2 at home with the schedule that they've got coming up. So there's a huge early sense of urgency for them. We'll see what the weather conditions are going to be and how the Radicals handle them as well. But I think, I mean, we've said before, like Madison doesn't usually blow teams out, and they also usually don't get blown out. So I expect this to be a really compelling game. I know it's not the sexiest Friday night Frisbee matchup, but I am excited about it. And I think like it's going to go down to the wire, and something strange is going to happen in the fourth quarter that is going to decide it. It's going to come down to something weird tomorrow night in Houston.
Well, and then we can also talk about the second game of Madison's road trip in Austin on Saturday night, and the Soul team that has to be absolutely licking their chops at the potential 2-0 start. And then they've got coming up in their schedule Houston at home on May 10th, Colorado at home on May 17th. And
that's
then
an intriguing game.
Oh, yeah, that's going to be a big, big interdivisional matchup. And then Friday, June 6th, they're at LA. And then Saturday, June 7th, they're at San Diego. And then they play host for a third time to Houston, third meeting, I should say, in 2025 on June 14th. I mean, this Soul team could potentially be at just 1 to 2 losses by the time we reach mid-June, if they can really take advantage of sort of this favorable scheduling and opportunistic matchups that they have.
Yeah, I'll take it a step further. I mean, Austin could be 7-0 heading into their game at Atlanta on June 27th. Now, I'm not predicting that, but it is certainly in the realm of possibility. They're probably home dogs against Colorado, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's the second day of a back-to-back for the Summit. And Austin was impressive last week. Like they're Armstrong brothers, all three of them made plays. It's so funny because I exchanged messages with Kyle Henke, and remember 8 years ago now when he was making these crazy greatests and buzzer beaters and one of the great highlight makers in the history of the league. And I don't want to say that he can't do that anymore because obviously he had some of those plays last year. But from talking to him, his mindset has changed and he has become such a mature leader for that O-line in terms of making the right choice. Obviously, he's capable of making the big play, but there is a quiet, poised confidence that Henke has leading that unit right now. And, Stephen Nagy, I got a lot of respect for him as a coach. So, yeah, I think Madison, even, if they play really, really well in Houston, they're underdogs going to Austin on Saturday, and I expect the Soul to be 2-0 and then 3-0, and I think they could easily be 7-0 when they go to Atlanta at the end of June. This is an Austin team that has a belief right now, and I think you hear that from a lot of teams in the preseason, early in the season, but there's something about the way the Soul have handled their business early that makes me kind of believe with them. And I'm not picking them to go to championship weekend, but I think this is a really competent, competitive team in the upper half of the division. And I don't know if this is the segue into the San Diego-LA doubleheader, the other two teams in the South Division, because this is a rivalry that has been really compelling for a long time. On paper, it looks like the Growlers have the edge. I know neither team is especially thrilled the way the schedule worked out. Like you play one team on a Saturday and then you play them again 100 or so miles away. Like how much coaching and studying and game planning can you do to implement something new if the first day doesn't work? I know that the teams weren't thrilled about that, but it is what it is. And what are you expecting from the Growlers and the Aviators?
I wrote about it in the rankings this week, a big Khalif El Salam game. I just keep hearing stuff about how he's become jaded after getting denied a spot on the World Games team. And if there's one thing I like to believe in, it's when an athlete gets pissed off and motivated. And he is one of those guys who, when he gets quiet, I feel like it's a time to really kind of perk up your ears. And he's been quiet the past off season or so. And I just think, him in combination with Travis Dunn leading that Growlers attack. Also, I've heard that KJ Koo is fully bought in this year and in a single game basis, he's been one of the most stellar West Division performers over the past couple years. If those three can find any sort of rhythm together, this Growlers team, again, kind of becomes what Oakland became last weekend, where it's like, man, I like a lot of stuff going on here. I think that they can make a run at the division title, and just becomes, again, one of these, 8 to 12 teams that we start talking about being able to possibly qualify for Madison Championship weekend in August. Like,
Adam, sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, we saw this a little bit with Dallas and Austin and Houston. I'm forever amused at just kind of the cross pollination between LA and San Diego. Like,
Oh, yeah.
I was just reminded looking at, they're like, oh, Will Turner's back. Oh wait, he was on the Aviators last year. Oh wait, he hasn't played for the Growlers since 2022. But like, he's active and like he's a really nice player. And just, we see Jesse Cohen. He's another guy that's been on both sides of this rivalry, playing his first game for the Growlers since 2022. We last saw Marcel Osborne playing with the Aviators.
My guy.
Yeah, he hasn't played for the Growlers since 2019, and yet he's back.
He had a terrific run with LA. He really became, I think, a standout playmaker. He was terrific in that game that the LA won against Oakland late in the 2023 season to effectively clinch a playoff spot. I'm really excited for all of the kind of re-adds that the Growlers did this offseason. It sort of feels like a mini version of what Toronto did as well, where they, add some new pieces, but also bring back some of the best stars from previous iterations of the Growlers roster. It just feels like, again, one of these teams and these lineups that's been a little bit undersold heading into this 2025 season. And if they get any sort of streakiness going, they can make a lot of noise in the West Division. Or excuse me, the South Division.
Put a dollar in the jar.
I almost got caught there, Evan. I almost got caught. This realignment, man, these first couple of weeks, I even need to remind myself.
Yeah, I've made the same mistake. One thing I'm curious about with LA is, obviously Brandon Van Dusen was injured most of last year, but like there have been so many touches just gobbled up by Van Dusen and Giannis. I mean, they've been among the league leaders in completions the last several years. I remember asking Jake Ballmer, the new coach of LA, in the preseason, like, are you confident that you have handlers that can handle those roles? No pun intended. And he was like, absolutely. Like he's very confident in his guys. And frankly, I'm curious to see it because obviously they don't have a ton of experience in the offensive backfield anymore. And San Diego knows that, and they're going to create a lot of pressure. Like Kevin Stewart, Kayla Helton, they create pressure when they're dialing up a defensive game plan. So, obviously, that these teams are very familiar with each other, but there's still some question marks. And, maybe this Growlers team knows like less about this Aviators team than any other Aviators team they've ever played. So this weekend, and particularly game 1 in LA on Saturday, might be the best chance of the season for LA to get a win against a Growlers team that on paper feels a little bit stronger. But again, as we started the pod, like when Philadelphia wins at DC, like LA beating San Diego would not be nearly the upset that is, just because of the familiarity of this rivalry and, the level of unknown with this LA team. And I've said before on the pod, like I like a bunch of their veterans, like, Sean McDougal and Mitchell Steiner and Zach Shackner and Nate Ransom. Like these are solid, decade-long UFA players, and they're not signing up for another season just to roll over to their rival. Like they're ready to compete and give it all they've got. And there's pressure on the Growlers to go 2-0 this weekend because of the dynamic of the division. Like San Diego's probably not making the playoffs if they don't win every game against the Aviators. So there's that.
All right, I've got 2 questions for you. First off, over under 5 goals for Sean McDougal. What are you taking?
Over.
Over? Yeah.
Yeah.
How many of them is he talking after? Just absolutely letting his former teammates have it. I feel like he is the number one instigator in both jerseys in this SoCal rivalry. Like,
It's
there
funny. I
should
didn't
be
even
almost,
remember that he played for the Growlers.
there's
2022, he played 12 games for the Growlers. I don't even remember that. I think of him as a forever Aviator.
Oh man, and he was ferocious when he matched up against the Aviators that year. I mean, he was really going at his LA team. And again, I feel like I need to make like a highlight or something of him in each jersey just yapping at the other version of himself, because that's the true, I think, trash talk we're all waiting for is McDougal versus McDougal. But yeah, I would take the over in the goals there. And then I'm wondering, and this is a little bit out loud, but when they're at their peak, is there a better 1-2 in the West Division than Travis Dunn and Khalif El-Salam?
Well, they play in the South Division, Adam.
South Division, excuse me. South Division. All right,
Because
I
in
got
my mind, I was going to be like, obviously,
there.
Selfridge and Chad Jorgensen. But
I
no.
know. I mean,
is there a better...
how about this? Where would you rank them as a 1-2 duo in the league? I mean, would you put them outside the top 5?
I don't know. I mean, we haven't seen them together very much historically, and we haven't seen them together in a long time. I mean, in the South Division, my mind went to, you know, Austin and Halsmeyer. Now, take
Yeah,
your pick.
that's where I am too.
Austin Taylor or Halsmeyer, or Hayden Austin Nab
I would
and
say Hayden
Halsmeyer.
Austin,
Either
Nab, and
way.
Holzmeyer. Yeah, that was where my
Either
mind
way.
went to.
Yeah, I don't know. Leo Gordon and anyone on the Spiders. Obviously, it's a little early to make that declaration. Um, I mean, they have that potential for sure. We'll see how they look together. We'll see whether they're playing together. But you're absolutely right. They're also two guys in their 30s that may not have quite the same uh, explosiveness as they once had, but still can be very, very solid, legitimate player. Let me think about that, and let's talk about it either at the end of the weekend or next week. Like best kind of two-man duos in the league, because
Well, we might
Sean
have to
Mott,
really.
Scott Heyman. Don't overlook those guys.
That was a vicious 1-2 punch in DC last weekend. And look, we might have to expand it more to like 3 or 4 player rotations, kind of like even the NBA has done. I'm always gonna, associate us with that league. But
Adam, before we go, there are 3 games we haven't touched on. I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on Vegas, Salt Lake, or Oakland, Oregon, but I'm curious to get your Central Division perspective on the only other game besides Madison and Houston that's happening on Friday night. Indy at Pittsburgh, season opener for both of these teams. Obviously, AlleyCats have a whole new look to their roster, and in some ways, Pittsburgh does too, with no Max Shepard, and a new era for the Thunderbirds team because Shep's been on the Thunderbirds roster every year for the last decade. What are you expecting in this season opener in the Steel City?
I think it's going to be very similar to, was it their first matchup last year when Pittsburgh set a then record for fewest turnovers in a single game? I think the Thunderbirds could have a similar performance here in week 2 at home in their home opener against Indy. I think that the AlleyCats are going to be, coming off of one of the most prodigious offseason turnovers this league has ever seen. They lose a handful of inaugural members to this league.
They lost thousands of scores.
They lost that. They lost their top 6 throwers from last year. There's just going to be a completely new look to this AlleyCats team. I'm really excited to see Carson Chamberlain playing for Indy, and I think that there's a couple other pieces, Seth Gudeman among them, that are going to be interesting to watch develop this year. But my eyes go to Pittsburgh in this matchup. And again, I think that the Thunderbirds have a real chance, kind of like they did early on last year at the 3 seed in the Central Division. This offense has really started a kind of generational shift beginning last year when Shepard was injured into a more possession-based and I think dynamic offensive look. Like you talk about the rookie throwers last year in Will Hoffenkamp and Anil Dreyhus, they really added a dimension to this Thunderbirds attack that they have lacked for several seasons. They're big guys. They can play a lot of possession between each other in the backfield, but they both have good deep throws, and they just have a variety of release angles, a lot of vision with their height to look over double teams, to kind of spot their receivers where they want to. And I think it's just provided an ease on the offensive side of the disc that the Thunderbirds have struggled with year in, year out. Shepard has been fantastic for them, but it's sort of like iso ball in basketball, where there's just a sluggishness that happens if your star isn't absolutely at their apex powers. And I think that you see Thunderbirds having a more sturdily built system. I think you see them plugging in new players that are really evolving in their roles. Aiden Landis, another, I think, player to watch in this Thunderbird system that had some really nice performances last year. And I think that Pittsburgh has an outside shot at, 7-8 wins in 2025 if they can get a week-to-week commitment and kind of win the games that they should, And we could be sitting here on, Sunday night, Monday morning, talking about how Indy looked really impressive and put up almost 30 against the Thunderbirds team that just struggles to get stops. I think that the Thunderbirds unfortunately struggle with one of the higher variabilities in their outcomes in this league. And we'll see if they can kind of correct that in 2025.
Speaking of that high variability outcome, they play at Detroit next week. The Thunderbirds need to start 2-0. They need to beat Indy at home. They need to win at Detroit, because their schedule after that is a gauntlet. At Madison and the Radicals' Bree Stevens home opener, then home for Minnesota, home for Carolina. Neither of those, you would think the Thunderbirds are the pregame favorite. And then after that, they're at Minnesota, home for Philly, which seems like a much tougher game than it once did, and then at Chicago. So that's a gauntlet coming up for Pittsburgh. They got 2 games to iron things out. And look, I also think, I'm not penciling in a win this weekend. I shouldn't say that. I am penciling in a Pittsburgh win, but I'm not putting in an ink, because I do think this Indy team is going to be a little bit better than we might be expecting. I think Drew Shepard's a really good coach. I think they've got some good young pieces. Ultimately, I think Friday night, Pittsburgh's going to have the edge due to experience and being at home, etc. But I'm with you, and I think this is an interesting game. I just wanted to touch on it before we signed off, because, 2 teams that I think both envision themselves competing with Madison for that 3rd spot. And, if you want to be that team, you got to win this game.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of pressure on the Central Division, who did not have games in the opening weekend slate last weekend, to come out and perform well in these early season matchups, because they all seemingly have this real thickening to their schedule competitiveness as we move deeper into the summer.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. It's going to be a fun weekend. 11 games on the docket after just 7 last weekend. We won't have seen every team in the league by the end of week 2, but we saw just about half the league last week, and we'll see several more teams this week. And the journey continues. I get on a plane to head to Houston in just a little bit here, and looking forward to launching the new weekend with Friday Night Frisbee presented by Pabst Light tomorrow night.
Yeah, that'll do it for this episode of Swing Pass. Evan, I'm looking forward to listening to you and Ian Toner on the call tomorrow night on Friday Night Frisbee, as well as the other 10 games in the Week 2 slate. You can watch all those games live on Watch UFA TV, and you can watch the Friday night game live and free on the UFA YouTube channel. Again, that'll do it for this episode of Swing Pass, but given how the season is going, we'll probably see you all in not too many hours with a rapid reaction to probably some more crazy results as the UFA season chugs into the deepness of its schedule. We'll be with you reacting all the way. Bye for now, and talk soon.